Thanks everyone for coming to this talk. It might be a little scattered, and I know that this talk is not the easiest thing to talk about, but I think given um, getting into open source is kind of a difficult thing, I wanted to share a little bit of maybe some things I've been thinking about in terms of different fears that you might have coming into open source, and then just fears that I have, even as someone that's been doing open source for a while now. And I guess a bit of background is I work on the Babel project. I've been doing it for a few years now. Um, and so yeah, let me get through. Okay, so when you're, first starting off in, I guess anything, but in open source specifically, you might have a lot of these initial questions of which project you should work on, what should I work on, what if the things that I do don't help the project? And I think these are all valid questions that don't really have like an easy answer necessarily. And I think that especially like say, which project, I think usually we would say you should work on something that you have familiarity with, you have context with, you maybe use it in your work or something that you're interested in, instead of simply going to the GitHub page and looking at the issues to try to figure out what's going on your own. But yeah, these are all things that I think we could do better at trying to guide people through. One thing I think about is making this metaphor of seeing that GitHub projects are kind of their own communities, and I think a lot of people have been talking about this today. And I like to think of it sort of like that each project, each repo is, you know, it has different scales. So like this example, I just took a screenshot of like a random project I had, has 0 stars. No one's, it hasn't been active for a long time. Maybe this is more of like a garden where there's, one person that cares about this thing, and maybe it would be nice if other people think it's helpful as well. Maybe, if it's Babel, it's more like a town. Um, Maybe if you work on something like Node or Linux, maybe it acts more like a city. And I think that I've had people ask about like what kind of etiquette you should have on open source, and I think it's important to realize that GitHub is a singular interface. It's hard to remember and realize that each repo or project has its own norms on how they do their work. Do they use pull requests? Do they have issues? Sometimes they don't do the same things as everyone else, even though on the in the UI everything looks the same. And so I think there can be a problem with communication between the project and new contributors, because it's hard to know like what to do next, other than saying things like, look at the contributing.md guide, or maybe we have a website that tells you what to do. If you think about going to like maybe a foreign country or a city, a lot of times you might, look at a guide or just look at YouTube to find out what it's like. You understand that people have certain ways of interacting with each other. Um, and I think everyone tries to be, or it's good to know that you're going in a different place and it's not the same as what you're used to. I don't think we do that much in open source, and I think maybe that's a lot to do with the fact that it's all on GitHub and it all looks the same. The only way we interact is through these issues, and a lot of times you never get to see people face to face. So something I think about as a maintainer is like how we can change that, within our own project, but then overall, I think it would be great to kind of change that, to help people feel more at ease as where they're at and stuff. I think that another fear is what your first contribution should be, and maybe you feel like it has to be this huge thing that changes the project, or something like that. And I think a lot of people maybe say this, that I think one thing you can do is go to this site called first pull request. You can look up anyone's username. For mine, it looks like mine was 9 years ago, and it wasn't merged. I looked at what I did. I think I didn't know how to use Git at the time, so I ended up adding all these other commits from other people, and it ended up being closed. So I guess just to say that people that seem like they're really experienced or successful, yeah, we all started out from the same place, not understanding what to do, and I think it would be helpful for the good first issues to kind of differentiate between what's, I guess, when we say a good first issue, it's like kind of hard to know, like, is it good because no, this person has never used GitHub before, and they're still, like, in this case for me, I was still trying to figure out how to use the Git itself, or is it the project, maybe trying to fix a bug fix or documentation change. Um, yeah, knowing that, oh, they have experience with Git and GitHub, but maybe not this specific project, like we can give them a different sense of what that is. My first contribution to a project that I eventually became the maintainer of, was just adding a table of contents. And it was really great to see the current, or that maintainer at the time was really helpful in just saying thanks. If you see here that it says, I made this Chrome extension that tells you the amount of PRs that people make to a repo when they submit a pull request. And so here it says first PR out of 124. And this is because I made that many eventually. But I think this can be helpful as a maintainer to know that, oh, the person here that's replying, it's their first time responding in this project or this organization or even on GitHub entirely. We should change how we interact with them. And I guess even if you're new, I think it might be really hard to say that you're new, but I think that's like it'll bring a lot of context to the person kind of trying to respond, because they maybe are too busy or just don't know what experience level you have in the project or with open source in general. But and it's funny because thinking about how long your contribution will last, you know, this Nat, CEO of GitHub, he just tweeted that GitHub now has this automatic table of contents button you can click on to get that. And so, the thing I made from those years ago, we don't even need it anymore. And so it's okay that the changes that you make might get replaced eventually, right? Not everything we do is going to last forever. And I guess maybe in some sense, maybe it's a bad thing if it lasts forever in terms of depending on what it is. That it's okay if these changes are temporary or need future changes. I think that, and also, yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask during this. I think I will probably end the talk earlier just so people can have a chance to ask specific things, because I'm not sure exactly what everyone's fears are. Yeah, and I guess related to this is just that, yeah, we don't. I think as a maintainer or as a new contributor, you might think that everything that needs to be done is already being taken care of by the maintainer. It's kind of funny that on the maintainer side, you might feel like there's so many things to do, and it's hard to kind of get all those things out of your head so that people can try to do them. And on the other side, if you're new, you think that everything's under control, that no one needs your help, or that the skills that you have aren't helpful for the project. When in reality, it's kind of like, how do we match these two together? And that's hard. That's really hard. I think another advice that I would give in terms of being not sure what to do is trying to embrace things that are what seem like useless or weird. One example I just thought of was Christina. This was a while ago. She just thought, as like a joke, to make a formatter. We have this program called Prettier, which makes your code formatted like automatically. And she was thinking, why don't we make a different one called Pettier, which just tells you that you should do, leaves comments and tells you what to do. And it's a funny joke that got a lot of traction, but then later she was like, oh, why don't I just learn how to maybe actually implement this, because then it'll help her learn how this thing works in the first place. And she used Babel to kind of figure out how to manipulate the code, and then maybe by open sourcing that learning, other people can understand how these tools work in the first place. And that's definitely an amazing contribution, because it brings more people into this general space, not just working on the serious things, because these fun things lead to people exploring and actually getting in-depth knowledge into how these things work. One example that happened recently is my friend Omar. He made a similar Prettier thing. I'm not sure if this video will play, but it takes any piece of text and it will format it in a certain way. And so in this scenario, I took that and I was like, oh, what if I could change that as well? So I made a version where it takes, I guess, Babel input or code that you would run through Babel, like in this case, JSX from React, and then it'll morph into what Babel turns it into, which is all these function calls. And then I think that's a great way of visualizing what's going on in a tool, and helping this visual way of seeing things might inspire people to want to contribute to Babel more than just saying like, oh, let's try to make it faster or all this technical stuff. And then later I got inspired to even take this approach and take a piece of code and play music over it, and then based on where your mouse moves, it will move the code. And this is completely useless, but because of this, I learned how to take the audio from my computer, like learning different APIs. Maybe this kind of fun little thing might get people to wonder how this works, and then if I put the code out there, they'll learn it. Maybe it might get more contributors. So I think we can think outside of the box in terms of how to approach what open source is supposed to be. I think this supposed to be is a just leads to a lot of, I guess, guilt. One example I think of in terms of, I guess, what we think are useless things that end up being really helpful is, like, say, origami. Origami tends to be, you think of it as something people do for fun. It's like an art thing. Maybe it's like peaceful to do it and you fold paper. But we use these ideas from origami in, like, say, when we try to create things that we send into space, like the solar panels that are able to fold up and then take up less space when we're sending it out to space, but then when they fold out, they have more surface area. And so I think, like, I would really encourage people to be cross-disciplinary, to take things that they're interested in, their hobbies, whether, a lot of people didn't graduate from a school or maybe a boot camp, or you're going to boot camp and you used to do something else. Like my old coworker was a musician, like all these different people that take all these experiences outside of tech into tech, or tech into other things, I think is amazing. And I think if we're really going to change some of the problems that we've had, it's because we keep doing the same solutions and just doing more of the same rather than taking, like, new ideas and incorporating together. Even though from the outset everyone might think that was like a horrible idea, you don't know. And I think being okay with failure and being okay with just like going with what your gut has is, like, freeing and also, like, fun, I think. Yeah, I know that's sort of maybe like a rant on that, but I think that's super important. And yeah, I guess this is kind of the point, is I want me, like, even especially me, is to reinstill the sense of play and excitement that I have. And I think doing anything for a long time, you get kind of jaded just because you're doing things that other people want. You're focused on, like, especially in our industry, it's about, like, speed and correctness and all that. And these are all valid and important things, but there are other values that are also important that I think they kind of shape each other. They help each other out. Why do people like Legos, Minecraft? There's people that learn programming through Minecraft because they have their own version of, I guess, electricity, redstone. And I think being able to do this in our industry, in open source even, right? It seems such like a technical, boring, or serious thing. I think how do we kind of combine these two things, I think would be great to change our culture. Yeah, and this is a little bit different, but I think a lot of the guilt that you have in open source, this is once you, I guess you're over your fear of your first contribution, you end up becoming a maintainer. So, like, for me, I kind of accidentally became a maintainer of Babel. I kind of made my first contributions. Eventually, just, like, you have this progression of things that you do. Like, you make your doc fix, and then your bug fix, and then make a feature, and then you're like, oh wait, maybe someone gives you responsibility. They're like, oh, now you can merge things, and you're afraid to do it. And so and eventually you're the maintainer now, and you're like, you realize, like, oh, I guess I've been given all this responsibility, and now you maybe feel guilty. So before, you're trying so hard to, like, get all these commits in and make your like the number go up, right? And eventually you wonder, well, I'm afraid of making those mistakes. Um, you spend a lot of time trying to fix other people's problems, which is a valid and awesome thing to do. But it's hard to kind of put boundaries on how much time you're spending. And I guess that's not that different in your own job or feeling like every second of your life needs to be, productive. I think definitely so in open source, right? You don't feel like you can have weekends or take vacation because you're available. You're making yourself available so often through GitHub or Twitter or Slack or giving talks or whatever it is. And I think it's so easy to kind of, in the beginning, you're trying so hard to, um, you know, continue to do more, like do more open source, which is great. But eventually, it's hard to remember to kind of take a step back or, you know, push the brakes. I think that there's this interesting law, Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. It seems to be true in a lot of places, like, with Google, with like knowing that you can increase your search. We have spam and SEO to get people to click on certain things, or yeah, clickbait, I guess. And even in the academic sense, the number of citations is like a measure of how amazing you are as a academic. So then that becomes something that people try to do, and then maybe that's not as useful. When you realize that you want to add tests, maybe you think that, oh, I need to cover every part of my code so that there's no possible chance of it having a bug. Um, and then I think this is true in open source. I mean, if you think about this picture, if you've seen GitHub before, the green squares, it's everywhere. You see it where you're walking around and seeing like buildings or like bathroom walls and stuff like that. And it's like, what does this evoke in your mind? And I think for a lot of people, it's like funny, maybe, because it's like, oh, that reminds me of GitHub. But I think maybe it might even evoke a sense of dread, that maybe it makes you think of how many GitHub squares you have and that you didn't have a streak. And it's good that they got rid of it, because we used to feel like you have to commit every day because of this, external requirement. And so, yeah, we have this bias where like once we see something, it's everywhere. Um, and so, looking at my contributions over the years, it looks like in 2016, 17, I was like at the peak, and then now I like went back down. And there's a lot of ways to interpret that. Did I get burnt out? Maybe I'm spending more time doing things that don't show up on the graph, um, or who knows, right? I think that this is the thing about data. You still have to interpret it, even though there's something there that maybe there's a story behind it that's not clear from seeing that. And unfortunately, yeah, a lot of times we are judged based on like what our GitHub graph says when you're trying to get a job or stuff like that. And I think that's this symptom of our, society wanting to measure everything and not wanting people to spend the time to figure out what someone's really about, right? And it sucks that it seems like all of our lives, not even open source, but right, through social media, are so public, and then you don't feel like you don't know what you can, how to really be yourself. Yeah, so here's an example. Monica had this post about explaining her year through her GitHub graph. And this wasn't like a negative or positive. It's just saying that these are kind of the things that I worked on. And I think that's really cool to kind of look back and see my progression. But the fear is like, well, are people going to judge me based on like what this graph says about my life? And I think Jen had a great post about this, that, it ultimately tracks code. It doesn't track you as a person. Your identity shouldn't be, even though I feel this all the time too, that you're going to be judged based on your output, right? You don't, where you had a baby, or you changed your job, or you moved. Like there's all these different things that you would have to ask someone, and you're not going to necessarily annotate your GitHub history like this, and maybe you don't want to. And I guess the pressure for that kind of sucks, right? And I think in general, something that I think is important is realizing that emotions are a big part of programming, even though it's a very technical thing. The reason why in this scenario, this tweet was talking about how my friend Omar, he was TAing a class on C, and you can use the debugger to figure out when something's wrong, or you can use like say console.log. And I think a lot of people would rather just do the console.log print statement, because it's a lot easier. You're in the flow, and there's almost this dread that you feel when you have to, oh, I have to do this different mode, click on debugger and make it work. And so a lot of our tools don't really take that into account, even the one that I work on. So yeah, if you see a graph that just is blank, right? There was say, I guess this was my contribution graph when I first started. It's almost like it just says that you just feel bad, you feel guilty about not having anything. And Ivan Illich has this quote about schooling is kind of the same. It's actually worse than to drop out of school than to not go to school at all, because it kind of tells you where you failed. If you dropped out in the first year, then that's really bad. Even though in tech, I guess a lot of people drop out. And so how do we react to this? One way of doing this is go back to the fun thing again, is like, well, that's why people create these programs that show how absurd it is to measure people's worth through the GitHub graph by, letting you create a picture that shows up in your GitHub graph instead. And it doesn't mean that like measurement is bad, and that there's some level that it's helpful for you to track yourself or other people, but we can't rely on it, right? We still need to talk to people. We need to make that as an account. And so there's a lot of work that goes into even a pull request. The time that you spent thinking about the problem, whether it was even worth working on at all, maybe those things aren't reflected in the pull request. You think about all the different things that go into a community or a company or a family or any kind of group. Not everything shows up, even if we want it to. And maybe some things we don't really want to be on there anyway. And I like this phrase that Illich came up with: shadow work is work that is necessary, but it doesn't show up in the economy, essentially, taking care of kids, or, the commute time to get to work, right? You're not really getting paid for that, but it's still necessary and important for the work that's being done. And I think even in open source is things that are in the shadows too, because even though it's public, no one really understands what is going on because you don't have to. It's like kind of underneath. It's the infrastructure. Open source itself has its own maintenance that might not be seen either. And so I guess just to say that there's a lot of things in open source that isn't just the code, right? And so you can be super valuable and important to a project, even if you aren't a programmer and you're still learning it for the first time. Even though I think we tend to emphasize it too much because open source at the core, I guess, has code in it, but there's all these things around it. So yeah, there's a lot of things behind the code, these avatars of people that we tend to forget, I guess. Yeah, these abstractions hide details, right? It's like the Jenga blocks in your dependency graph, and that hides the people that work on them ultimately. Yeah, so I think there's this difference between using, right, a car or open source and then maintaining it, and how do we kind of, I guess, lessen the gap between people that are creators and consumers, right? And the farther away we are from what we use, I think it kind of yeah, I guess it kind of has a lot of issues, basically outsourcing, right? We outsource things to other people, and it helps us not have to appreciate what happens. This is true in terms of, like, say, our food. Like, maybe we used to make our own food, grow our own food. Now we go to the grocery store or we order it. And of course, at some level, you can't do everything yourself, but it's like, how do we create a balance where we can rely on each other and ourselves, but then not depend entirely on these services. So I think this matters because programming, I guess, the fear is that like everything will become measured and that like AI is going to do everything, but in reality the people are the ones maintaining these open source projects. So and I think that this is reflected in the or how the code is actually formed. Like in some sense, there's like these, I guess, ideologies within the framework of the code itself, even if it's not explicit. And it's reflected in the people. And so that's why it's so hard to work with a code base where you've never seen it before. And I guess that's why open source is hard, because you don't know why someone made something in the first place. And it might not be written down. If it is written down, it might not, you can't talk to them, then that would be a lot harder to understand how it works. Um, I'm gonna skip through some of this because I want to get to the, yeah, I want to do like a Q&A. So uh, yeah, so the code isn't all there is. I guess that's all I want to say. That open source projects are going to have issues. The best companies in the world have issues. Standards have issues. So if you think that everything is working, I guess that's really mistaken. We have a lot of issues and a lot of things that if a project is so big, the maintainer can't put everything in their own head, right? And they're going to overlook things. And I think if everyone can, I guess, be willing to ask, like, why is this like this? Maybe not in an accusatory way. Then maybe like, oh, I never thought of it that way, and that could be an improvement to the project. I think the willingness to be curious and ask questions is really great. That I think that especially if you're new, you tend to have that more maybe than the people that work on it because they're so preoccupied with certain ways of doing things. And I guess, yeah, keeping that sense of curiosity is really great when you're trying to contribute or make your own project. Yeah, so programming is about the theory, the mental model that you have in the program, not necessarily just the code. It's just like kind of the artifact that's created from when you make that code. And so, yeah, I guess all to say that the people behind the project and the people that are using it are important. And even though we want to hide behind, I don't know, the computer to figure out how to, or maybe not want to deal with people, we kind of have to eventually. Um, and yeah, and I think there's this desire to replace people with tools, but eventually those are the things that kind of in some sense enslave us. Being addicted to our phones or whatever. How do we create these tools that work with us rather than work for us? I think is a really valid insight into how we should think about, I guess, technology in general, but then specifically open source too. Um, let me. Yeah, so I really like this example of this shrine where the people that work on it, they actually have to, every generation they destroy the whole temple and they make it again. And it's an acknowledgement that it's not enough to have the documentation or the tools to make this shrine, but that the people that are in it or in that community have to have the knowledge themselves to do it. So it's like a passing down of knowledge, and it's a really explicit way of seeing this. So technology, we like to think, is going to be replaced by, I don't know, these documents or the code itself. Like, what happens if the people leave or whatever? But there's a lot of things that aren't able to be expressed through the documentation, even though we want to try as hard as we can to do that. Yeah, so I guess similar with cooking. Like, if someone gave me this really great equipment, like a knife and a good cookbook, it doesn't mean I'll be able to make a really good recipe. And so maybe that's why mentorship is so important for what we're doing. Similar to having the best editor or having a lot of commits, or having good docs, you kind of still need like people to be able to pass knowledge down from one another, maybe even more in a one-to-one way. And so, yeah, a lot of coding isn't really about coding, even though you still need to have that context. And so, yeah, we can't really replace people. It doesn't mean to say that that people have to be these celebrities or anything, but just to say that people in general are important. And even if you might feel the guilt of being a part of an open source project. So yeah, like, can we treat open source projects, even though there aren't real people, as sort of like this living thing? The idea that cities are living, not literally living things, but like metaphorically, they're not just the buildings. The environment isn't just this resource that we can use, but we want to take care of it. Just like open source, maybe we can take care of that too. It's not just code. And I think this is kind of embodied in this idea that we have knowledge that is in people's heads. It's personal, it's tacit, it's more than we can express, and it takes time. There's all these things that we can learn in tech and outside of tech that might not be able to be written down, but it shapes who you are as a person, and I think it changes who you are. I like Dan's quote about how there's all these firsts in open source. You're never gonna stop being a new person. There's the first bug, first PR, first time you got angry at someone, first grammar fix. You know, all these different firsts. And you keep messing up, and sometimes you meet some amazing people. And so, I guess I'd like to hope that this is from Nicola, one of my teammates on the project, and he was sharing about how you know, that it was a way for him to grow as a person. I think that's really awesome to see. Um, and so this question of like how do we look at the world is I think is really important. I work on this project called Babel, of all things, and you know if you know the story from the Old Testament about the Tower of Babel, about how people were trying to get to heaven and trying to build their way up there because they had, I guess, the pride of doing that. And I think it's important for us as maintainers to, yeah, to I guess be okay with being afraid and being just asking the same questions that we had when we started in the first place. But yeah, so that's all I had. Thanks. So yeah, if you're happy to take questions, if you have any specific thoughts on that. I know that was a lot to go over. So
We do have one question in the
mm-hmm.
Q&A interface.
Okay. I guess I'll stop sharing. Let me see if that's okay. Okay. Can you still see me? I'm not sure if. Okay.
We're able to see you, not your screen.
Okay. Oh yeah, I was just gonna do my video if that was cool. Okay.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, I got a question. Thanks for taking time. Do you have any recommendations for overcoming lack of confidence in programmatical thinking and not feeling as if one is making a fool of oneself? What would you think this is more of a personality trait to overcome? Good question. Um, yeah, I think that seems to be the problem. Well, I think that if you are already a developer, right? You're already writing code in a company, or you know maybe you made your own projects. I mean, there is a sense that it's not that different from working at a company. When like say it's your first day, right? You're gonna have to figure out how it works, and of course, there's an onboarding process. People will help you, and I definitely agree that open source is lacking in that more than at a company because I guess it's their job to help you as a teammate. Um, I don't know if there's I guess there's things that you can do yourself, but then there's also things that the project that you're gonna contribute to could do. But and also it depends on the project. Maybe some projects don't um, they aren't accepting contributions. That's possible. But it's good to kind of look for projects that they're seeking that. And I think saying upfront like, "Hey, I'm new. Is anyone willing to like maybe walk me through this?" I guess just communicating that could be a big part of that. And if they don't respond, then I guess you can move on to the next project because I guess it's hard because it's like you want to expect that there'll be someone there, but it's like on the other side, maybe they have 100 people asking, so it's hard to know um, what that yeah what that's like. Yeah, but I wouldn't want to say that like certain personalities can't contribute to open source or anything. Um, I think you're always gonna have some kind of fear, and it's like even after your major first contributions, I think you'll get used to the workflow maybe, and you'll feel a little bit more confident. But you know, if you contribute to a new project that you've never done before, it's still gonna be difficult, right, to figure out. It feel like you know what you're doing because I mean it's not really expected that you should maybe.